Dana pull up his presentation while I just tell you a bit about them. So Becky Tharp is the founder and lead scientist at Just Water Consulting, a Vermont-based aquatic science consulting firm established in 2019. Just Water focuses on water quality monitoring and data analysis to inform management and policy decisions. Becky completed graduate studies at UVM's Plant and Soil Sciences Department and the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, where she studied ecological methods for water treatment. Prior to Just Water, Becky managed the Water Quality Research Program at Watershed Consulting Associates and served as a team member with us at Lake Champlain Sea Grant and Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. She's focused on green stormwater infrastructure. Dana Allen is a principal at Fluid State Consultancy. He has a BA from Middlebury College in Environmental Studies and Geography and a Master's in Science from the University of Vermont's Department of Plant and Soil Science, where he focused on the use of alternative media for phosphorus removal from wastewater and stormwater. Following graduation from UVM, Dana has worked for 6 years in stormwater management consulting. He specializes in water quality investigations, stormwater best management practices design, mapping and GIS, and public outreach. Dana believes strongly that one of the keys to sustainability in Vermont, both ecologically and economically, is clean water for everyone. So thank you, Becky and Dana, for presenting your work today. And we'll turn it over to Dana.
All right, thank you so much. So yeah, we're glad to have everyone with us. And just confirming everyone can see my screen, correct? Okay, wicked. So today's talk is called Salt of the Earth, Vermont's Hidden Pollution Problem. We thought we were very clever coming up with this name, but there's an element of seriousness to it because in Vermont, we pay a lot of attention to certain pollutants, namely phosphorus, whereas what we're going to be talking about today, de-icing salt, chloride pollution, doesn't get as much attention, is quite hard to see and quite hard to figure out the impacts of at times, but is a very pernicious problem, maybe even more so than phosphorus, because with phosphorus, there's relatively easy ways to mitigate for it. With salt, as we'll learn, it's not as easy to get rid of. So, let's see. There we go. So today's outline is pretty brief. We're going to be talking about de-icing salt background, the what, why, and where of de-icing salts. So we're going to keep that pretty quick. And then we're going to talk about the monitoring site, which is in Shelburne, Vermont. It's called the Shelburne Transload facility. We're going to give you a little bit of background, the purpose and the methods that we use to track this issue. So how did we evaluate the de-icing salt impact? And we're going to go over our findings. And essentially the spoiler here is that modeling and monitoring methods for de-icing salts, at least for in this instance, may not be adequate as they were currently laid out or practiced. We won't give you any conclusions just yet. And then we're going to give you some takeaways, like what are we going to do with this? Because it's nice to study something, but then how do you build on it? Where do you go from there? And then you'll have a chance to ask some questions. So de-icing salt. As Vermonters, or I'm assuming most of us are Vermonters or maybe upstate New Yorkers, we're probably pretty familiar with de-icing salt and what it is. You know, where do we use it? Well, we use it on road networks. Probably today's snowstorm is bringing out some of that. Use a lot of it on parking lots in Vermont. Slip and fall, that's a real concern. So a lot of parking lot applications across the state and sidewalks, of course. So we're just basically trying to get rid of ice. Studies have shown over the decades that this improves road safety between 87 and 78%, or 87 and 78% accident reduction on 2-lane and multi-lane roads, respectively. So we're talking about something that is hugely important to our transportation networks, which is the backbone of many, many, many parts of our economy. So this is something that is critical to functioning in areas like ours. You know, and it also reduces slip and fall accidents on sidewalks and parking lots. So that is very key for a lot of private businesses and public entities. How does it work? Well, basically it lowers the freezing point of water. And so different types of de-icing salts can work at different temperatures. So common compounds are sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium. Although sodium chloride, which is the most common type, that's what we're mostly familiar with, also called rock salt, is the most common because it's fairly cheap and it's got a good temperature range for most winter conditions. You will see calcium chloride, potassium chloride used on occasion, although magnesium chloride tends to be used a bit more in areas like Vermont for colder conditions. So that's good to keep in mind, that those are the basic constituents of de-icing salts, the anions and cations. So how much do we use? Well, we use quite a lot. In the 1940s, when we started, basically experimenting with the use and seeing, how could this work, 0.15 metric tons were applied, average in those years. By 2005, we were applying as many as 18 million metric tons. And data from 2015 suggests that as much as 22 million metric tons are being applied. Now, this is a little difficult because, state highway departments, departments of transportation, that sort of thing, they keep pretty good records. Towns, cities, that sort of thing, they keep pretty good records. A lot of this is based on mining and quarrying for those materials and production of those materials. It's very hard to track private usage on parking lots and things like sidewalks and that sort of thing. So if anything, this may be a somewhat conservative number, but the increase from 1940 to the present day is astronomical. So the takeaway is that we have been and will continue to use a lot of salt, just as a general trend. It doesn't seem to be flattening out. So basically what happens, this is like chemistry 101, maybe even 100. But basically what happens with salts in the environment, or what happens when they get into water, is that the ions in them, so in this case, sodium chloride, readily disassociate and go into solution. So you have these Cl- ions, these chlorine anions, and then you have the Na+ or sodium cations. So those actually disassociate from each other. The particles break up, they go into solution. So this little graph down here kind of shows the basics of what happens in a dissolution reaction. The important thing to remember here is that all of a sudden you've got something that's a solid that's now in essentially a liquid phase. So in order to remove that from a liquid phase, that gets quite tricky. That's very different from certain types of phosphorus, at least, although not all types of phosphorus. The other thing to keep in mind here is, so we've got this Cl- floating around in water. That doesn't readily attach to pretty much anything other than those anions or those cations. However, we also have these soil cations, sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium. Those are also disassociated, and those more readily bind to certain types of soils. Now, that's something that we are going to look at a little bit in today's study, and that's actually something that we are interested in future studies, is what is the fate of those cations, and how can we use that to potentially track the impact of de-icing salt in the environment. So we've talked a little bit about this, but salt is a problem. And where is it typically a problem? Well, it's more of a distributed problem because we primarily use it on road networks. Obviously these road networks are all over the place. They frequently cross water bodies such as wetlands, streams, ponds, things like that. The other aspect of this is that even if those distributed networks aren't adjacent to water bodies directly, they're often served by closed stormwater catchment systems. So those collection systems often discharge to or adjacent to water bodies. So essentially they're grabbing a lot of this de-icing salt that has melted the snow and ice on sidewalks and things like that, and is discharging directly to water. So we're putting it into the environment, into water bodies fairly effectively, even from these distributed networks. And a lot of these runoff management measures, stormwater management, think of a rock-lined ditch, which is okay for particulates. That does nothing for dissolved ions. Even filters and infiltration, not really going to do a whole lot for ions in solution, especially chloride. But what about point sources? There's been a fair bit of study of de-icing salt on road networks, the impact adjacent to those road networks, things like that. But what about point sources? Well, one of the point sources that we're going to be talking about a lot today, salt storage sites are one, but salt transportation sites are another. Now, a salt storage site is like, think of your town gravel pit. or your town salt and sand storage area. That's a salt storage site. But a salt transportation site is basically how the salt gets from wherever it comes from, the mine, the quarry, what have you, the producer, and then is distributed regionally. Those areas are taking a phenomenal amount of salt on an annual basis, gathering it in one place, and then distributing it via truck, rail, however. That's what we're talking about today. These are places with a very high spatial concentration of salt. So our study site, and we're going to look at this in maps, but basically this is the overview. It's called the Shelburne Transload facility. It was built in 2016, and it's adjacent to one of Vermont's, I believe, 8. We have 8 Class 1 wetlands in Vermont. They're wetlands of significant value. It's adjacent to a Class 1 wetland on the Plata River. There was a bit of a local opposition, but it was permitted for construction due to a federal exemption. And let's see, I'm going to switch real quick here to a nice little context map. There we go. So what we're talking about is essentially this facility right here, and I'll back out a little ways. So we can see right here, we're at the mouth of the La Plata River. This is Bay Road going into Lake Champlain. Up that river in green here, you've got the Class 1 wetland delineation. And then if you follow the river channel, which is right here, the salt storage facility is right there. So located adjacent to that Class 1 wetland, and relatively close to the main stem of the river. And we essentially did monitoring around this site at these points. So we had a control site down here, which is a relatively unaffected drainage area in this area. There's a little bit of development in it, but it's mostly unaffected by development, generally speaking. This site has stormwater management features on it, namely a wet detention pond, which you can see in this area here. We monitored at the outfall of that wet detention pond on land owned by the Nature Conservancy. We also monitored another point, which we're calling the seep, and then there's another monitoring point, the La Plata at seep, or a monitoring point in the river. So actually monitoring river water for chloride concentration. The pond outlet point monitors surface water, so waters that are flowing across these surfaces. These are the salt storage sheds here. This is a rail spur coming through, rail cars coming here. Salt is unloaded in this location and then trucked and stored in these large buildings here. Most of the runoff on the site basically flows down this way or overland this way to this pond where it's concentrated, and then it flows a surface flow out of that pond. That's the water we were picking up there. We're also monitoring shallow groundwater at the seep site. This entire area, you can kind of see it from the topography, but it's a sandy terrace overlaying a clay layer. So essentially what happens is water infiltrates into that sandy terrace, hits that restricting layer of clay, and comes out at the toe of the slope here. There's a number of seeps along this shoreline. We picked one of those to monitor as an indicator of what this site could potentially be doing to shallow groundwater conditions. And so that's essentially, those are essentially our 4 monitoring points. And Becky will be talking a bit more about the specific methods that we used. And just as a quick comparison, we can kind of look at what this site looked like prior to. So we can see in 2015, this was a relatively unaffected sandy terrace, forested area, clay plain forest. And then in 2016, it gets fairly cleared. And then the most recent imagery from 2018 shows obviously those 2 large buildings, the pond, and you can see our monitoring points control pond outlet for the surface water from the site, and then the seep and the river monitoring point. It's important to note here that there's another point of interest that's slightly downstream from this area. So we can see here's the Shelburne Transload facility. Here are our monitoring points. And there's actually a monitoring point down here. That was a monitoring point that was chosen for modeling and monitoring by the permittee and the state of Vermont as an indicator, essentially saying like, we're gonna monitor this point to look for exceedances of the state's chloride threshold. The complicating factor there is that there's a significant watershed that flows through the La Plata, and we'll actually go back to the PowerPoint to look at that. Let's skip over a couple of these real quick. But our study site is way down here. The red outline indicates the La Plata River watershed, generally speaking. The study site, as I mentioned, is right there. And then the watershed that contributes to that monitoring point that's downstream from the Shelburne Transload facility is actually this entire watershed. So one of the things that we wanted to evaluate in this study is, what are we seeing at the outlet of this pond or this wet detention pond, as well as at the seep, versus what's being reported downstream of this, and how do they line up? Would this downstream point actually capture some sort of impact or damage or not? And so that was one of our primary goals, is to evaluate that. So as I just said, goal, determine if modeling and monitoring by the Shelburne Transload facility adequately characterize impact to the Class 1 wetland complex on the La Plata. So we did that by identifying points of discharge from the facility, as well as that reference zone. We monitored the water continuously, and Becky will talk about this a little bit more, but we used a method called specific conductance and then a regression model to essentially turn conductivity into chloride concentration. And then in this study, this initial one, we also sampled soils for salt at a couple discharge points, as well as within a reference area. And we also sampled vegetation just to see what the impacts were there. So Becky, this is now you. So if you want to take control.
Yes, I do. Okay, great. Thanks, Dana. So just following up with what Dana was saying, I'll explain a little bit about the study method. So we were looking at surface waters in the wetland near the pond outlet, and also at a seep site at a toe of a slope where water and salt move through the soil profile at the area where the salt unloading happens at the when the rail cars come in. And in both cases, we're using this this monitoring method, which is just a perforated pipe in order to pick up really shallow groundwater and surface water. And then inside those monitoring wells, we have 2 different types of probes. We're using the in situ Aquatrol 200 and 600 probes. And they're similar but the one only measures conductivity and the other has the potential to measure chloride directly through a selective electrode. And with the conductivity measurements, we transferred them to chloride using the state regression equation. So that type of monitoring was happening at the control site, at the pond outlet in the wetland. We call it the pond outlet site, but it's truly a site inside the wetland. It's just adjacent to the pond outlet at the seep and in the La Plata itself. We have that kind of every 15-minute monitoring happening. And then we did grab samples every 2 to 4 weeks to measure directly for chloride. And that helped in a couple of different ways. One, to corroborate the findings of the regression equation and to make sure what we were finding with the tools were the same as we would with direct grab samples. So that was like the contents of the water monitoring. But we also looked at soils, and the reason we were looking at soils, just to harken back to what Dana was saying at the first part, is that there's when the water is exiting this site, either through the pond outlet or seeping through the soil on the site, and then out either into the wetland or into the La Plata River, it's moving through a soil profile, and it's not inert, it's interacting with those soils. And in terms of the chloride, it can supersaturate, the chloride can get around the soil particles. But for the cations, which is primarily sodium chloride, which we learned through this process, but the cations will interact with the existing native soil cations, and in some cases displace native soil cations. And so we wanted to understand if that was happening at this site and if we could pick up a signal. We weren't sure if we would be able to. So we sampled some soils, and so we did that by taking soil cores in the wetland surrounding the pond outlet site, at the control site, and at the seep site, and we analyzed those for chloride, sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium. That was actually all run, all those samples were analyzed at the UVM AETL lab. And if you're interested in more details about the methods, I would direct you to the paper, because there's more details obviously there. So we're not going to cover it in great detail about the lab methods. And lastly, we also took some vegetation samples. So these are really preliminary vegetation type samples, but we had noticed just anecdotally on the site that the hemlocks that are surrounding the salt transload facility, some of them were browning and showing signs of leaf burn or needle burn. And so we wondered, was that a result of the chloride, and could we even measure an increased level of chloride in some of those hemlocks, because the species diversity is pretty similar between the control and the pond outlet and the seep. So we took samples of hemlock needles and twigs and had them analyzed for chloride at those 3 sites as well. So I'm just going to jump right into the results. So before I tell you the results, I want to just cue you up about what the standards are. So the standards that we're using, which you'll see across all of the graphs, are based on this aquatic organism standard. So this is an EPA and Vermont DEC standard. And the acute standard is a 1 hour average that cannot exceed 860 milligrams per liter, meaning that it's acutely toxic to aquatic organisms at that point. And then there's a chronic standard, which is 430 milligrams per liter chloride, that shouldn't be exceeded as a 4-day average. So this is how it's going to show up in all the graphs, just so when you see these, you understand that bottom line is the chronic standard, and that top line within the red is the acute standard. So just to give you it'll give you a framework for what we're seeing. So this graph is just the grab samples. So we took all the grab samples over these 2 years of monitoring and just put them all together, just the grabs, none of the continuous monitoring. And you can see that the box on the furthest to the left is the control site. The one in the middle is from the seep, and the one on the farthest to the right is the pond outlet samples. And the letters indicate a statistically significant difference. So if there are 2 B's, that means they're not statistically significantly different, and the A and the B indicates that they are different. And so to sum that up, the control site is different and lower than both the seep and the pond outlet. And you can see that the seep is much higher, and at times some of those samples were above the acute standard, so above 860 milligrams per liter, and the pond outlet was commonly above the chronic standard, but not always. And a little summary statistics in that little table on the right. So then to dig into it a little bit more, this is the continuous monitoring data. And I'll go through this for each of the sites. So this is based on 15-minute increment data taken at each of the sites. And all of the little triangles indicate grab samples. So this is at the seep. And so you'll see that in the spring of 2018, there's just grab samples. And so this was prior to the continuous monitoring equipment being installed. And you'll see that those numbers are really high. And then when the monitoring equipment is installed later in the spring, you'll see that the numbers seem to be lower. And we think that the reason this is that before the monitoring equipment was installed, there wasn't a shallow well there. We were taking these water samples directly from the seep. And when we installed the shallow well, because you need some kind of a sump in order for the probe to work, you need to have a standing pool of water, that it actually filters out some of the chloride as a result of just that physical barrier moving into the monitoring well, which is surrounded by a filter fabric. And so if anything, these numbers are conservative. So just to give you a sense. But there is some fluctuation. So we see that in the summertime, numbers spiked up above the acute standard, and then in 2018, and then it kind of dropped down low during the winter, and then it dropped down really low in the spring of the following year, and then it kind of bumped back up. And you can see there's this precipitation and temperature and rainfall, or the precipitation and temperature data on the top of the graph, and this will be across all of the graphs that that will come after this. And we were looking at this because it's a common pattern when you study chloride impact in water bodies from diffuse networks like road networks, that you see these patterns that correlate with the precipitation patterns. So it makes sense, right? So salt is applied to the roadway, and then it rains or it melts, and then that salt is washed off into the waterway. And you'll see either a spike of that salt at that time, or in some cases, you'll see a reduction later in the storm because your volume of water is so high. So we wanted to see if there was a similar pattern. And this is what's interesting about this particular case, more that makes it different than the diffuse road networks, is that the patterns are really different, because it's not like there's just salt here when it's icy. There's salt here all the time, 365 days a year. They're moving salt in and out, and it's being tracked in and out. And so it really operates more like a point source, and it's less subject to the whims of the temperature. So you'll see that pattern throughout. So here's the pond outlet concentrations for the water. So again, you'll see that we had some periods in the spring, early in the spring, where the numbers were really consistently above the chronic standard. And then you'll see in the spring of 2018, as well as in the spring of 2019, we had really low concentrations of chloride. And those times correlated with high water levels in the lake. So this site is pretty close to the outlet, as you saw with Dana's maps. And so we get backwatering events. So really this is lake water at this point, because it's so close. And so it's just a lower concentration because you have so much more water in that area. So as soon as that, as the lake level goes down in the spring, we see that those numbers in the wetland pop right back up. So they're above chronic level. So by and large, the concentrations in the wetland are consistently above the chronic level, certainly more than just for 4 days at a time. This is the graph for the control site. So the control, you'll see that this is it's a little spotty with the continuous measurements, and that's because the control site is it's a little different than the other sites. It's not receiving water from a stormwater pond, so it's not getting really consistent flow, and it's in a forested watershed. And so it doesn't always have flow in the channel. And so that's why it's not as continuous. But you will notice that whenever we are able to get a sample at the control, the numbers are much lower than they are at the pond outlet or at the seep. They're generally around 10 milligrams per liter. And lastly, this is the La Platte at seep chloride concentrations. I just want to point one thing out to you, and that is that you'll notice that the extent of time is slightly different than it was on the other sites. So this one starts in July instead of in, well, I guess it was March or April of 2018. And then there's a period where it's not in the water here in January of 2019. And that's just because of freezing conditions in the river. It's not really appropriate to do that kind of monitoring in a river of that size. You lose equipment and have equipment damage. But whenever there is data for within the La Platte, it's around 30 to 40, sometimes up to 50 milligrams per liter. So now switching over to the results for the soil samples. So these are in the same order as the grab sample that I showed you for the water. So all of the box plots to the leftmost are the control, then the seep is in the middle, and the pond outlet is on the end. So again, with chloride, you'll see that the seep has the highest amount of chloride in the grab samples when compared to the other sites. and that the seep and the pond outlet have more chloride than the control, but they don't statistically have any more chloride than each other. But where it gets interesting is when you look at the sodium plot, so that's the upper right, you'll see that the pond outlet, this is a switch basically in the pattern. The sodium concentrations in the soils are much higher at the pond outlet than they are at the seep. And this makes sense when you think about what's happening at this site. All of the water from the site is being funneled into a stormwater pond, and which means all of the salt that falls onto the impervious surfaces also is being washed off into this stormwater pond, and it almost always is discharging water. There's always water flowing out of it, certainly after rain events. So a volume of water is huge from the site, even though the concentrations are lower of chloride when we measure them. But because the total volume of water is more, your total mass of chloride ions and sodium ions is much higher than it is at the seep site, which isn't really a point source that's being directed. No water is being directed at the seep. It's just kind of water's falling there from rainfall and moving those ions through the soil profile and then exiting through that toe of the slope just above the Plata. So this is an interesting finding because it really gives you a way to measure the mass movement of the soil, of the salt, that is in ways a lot simpler than it would be to measure that mass if you were just looking at the water, because you would need a flow, you'd need to have a concurrent flow measurement. So from this, we can see that sodium is certainly really high in those soils at the pond outlet, much higher than it is in the native soils at the control, and higher than it is at the pond outlet, even though, or much higher than it is at the seep, even though the seep chloride concentrations are very high, in fact, and sometimes exceeding chloride standards for state water quality. The other cations, the potassium and magnesium, are not different among sites, but you can see that the pond outlet for magnesium, it appears like it may be trending towards being higher than the control and the seep site. And that may be because there is some magnesium chloride stored at the site, but it's not the primary type of salt used. And so it's a slower process for that disassociation of the cations. So this is a concern because the native soils have a certain ratio of different cations. And if we're loading the sodium and magnesium into the wetland, you'll be dissociating native soil cations in favor of these other ones, which means over time that there may not be enough of a critical type of cation in those soils to support life in the wetland. And so the last section of results is the vegetation samples. So the hemlock needle chloride concentrations, again, same order, control, seep, and pond outlet. And you'll see the control has a lower concentration of chloride in the needle samples than there is at the seep and the pond outlet. So there is chloride being taken up into these hemlocks. What the implications of that are wasn't part of our study. It's really just about, is it there and can we measure it? And so it certainly is there. Is that what's causing the browning or the death or dieback of other species is something that we're exploring with a group of biologists. But at this point, we just know that there's more salt and it's being taken up by the species that are there. So the conclusions from this study are that certainly the salt loading in the wetland exceeds state and federal freshwater standards, and they exceed them consistently. The chronic level is exceeded at both sites consistently, and that is within a Class 1 wetland. That the current monitoring and modeling efforts that the permittee used in order to be able to build the structures that are on site really are inadequate, obviously, to characterize the pollution movement, because what they had done indicated that this isn't going to be a problem, and they are doing ongoing monitoring, and according to their monitoring, it is not a problem. And part of that is because we propose that they're monitoring inappropriately at the locations that they're choosing, because they're so far downstream from the input points that they're in too big of a water body to be able to pick up that signal. And we also argue that using different methods like looking at soils and looking at cations can help look a little bit more robustly at the mass issue versus just looking at the concentration of chloride in water. And we believe that there is improved monitoring methods needed, not just at this site, but at large, for monitoring and trying to understand the movement of chloride through the environment before it's too late. Because as Dana noted, trying to remediate chloride once it's in the environment is exceedingly difficult. So those changes that we propose would be the location of monitoring, the media that is being monitored, the frequency, and the types of control structures that are used at chloride heavy sites. So our next steps, we're doing some additional soil sampling. We're looking at changes with depth and the breadth so we can try and get a 3D picture of where the salt is moving and how fast it's moving. We're trying to understand if chloride's being flushed from those soils in the spring flood events. Does the timing of that flushing potentially negatively impact spawning fish and frogs that are at that soil water interface? And the vegetation sampling, we need to work in tandem with a plant biologist, which we're doing, to better assess what the impact is. You know, we can measure that there is salt in those plants, but really getting, working with someone who understands at what point the plant is harmed and wouldn't be able to reproduce or wouldn't be able to survive in that area is really critical. But certainly it's not getting any less. And so over time, these will just continue to build up in the soil. So it's a concern, and especially a concern because this is a Class 1 wetland. Thank you all so much for listening. And I think Dana and I would be happy to take questions if you have any.